When my dad passed away, not only did he pass along his fishing boat, but he also passed along his love of fishing to me. The boat is a which has a decent-sized cabin allowing me to go overnight deep-sea fishing. I usually fish off the coast and would sail for an hour out to sea, then stop and spend the rest of the day fishing. That's exactly what I did one Friday, taking my cousin Tony. We planned to spend the night and fish most of Friday before sailing back. So, after sailing out to sea for about an hour, I picked the spot for us to stop and cast our lines. We brought a radio and tons of beers to make the time more pleasant. The sun started to set, and seeing the sun setting on the horizon with no visual intrusions was a beautiful sight, perhaps the last pleasant thing that would happen that night. By the time the sky was completely dark, we had already packed our stuff for the night and were inside the cabin playing cards and eating burgers. Mid-conversation, Tony stopped me and told me to listen. There was the sound of a boat motor in the distance. We left the cabin to look into the horizon, but with no moon, it was just too dark to see more than maybe 50 feet in front of us. But over the calm waves, we did hear a boat motor. Whoever was out there didn't have their lights on. The lights in my cabin were on, which was definitely enough for anyone to see us and avoid hitting us. We were expecting the sound of the other boat to sail away into the night. However, it seemed to circle us for a bit, then abruptly stopped. The motor just cut. There was nothing but the sound of the calm water splashing against the boat. Tony started acting a little paranoid. He thought we were being stalked. He wanted me to use the spotlight to look for where this boat could be. I didn't want to do that because that would be a bit obnoxious and obvious. To make him happy, though, I started to drive the boat for a few minutes away from the last direction we heard that engine stop. Maybe I did it because I was a little suspicious about it as well. After a solid 5 minutes of driving the boat in the opposite direction, I killed the motor and we went back inside the cabin to resume playing cards. It felt like only seconds after we sat down, we heard it again. This time I heard it first, and it sounded like the motor was being given much less gas. We went outside again, and at that instant, the sound stopped. This time, I agreed with Tony, turning on the spotlight was a necessity. The spotlight only rotated 180 degrees, so I turned the boat a little to the right so that I could point the light out in the direction we heard the boat. The beam of light shot far into the horizon. I felt my heart racing as I slowly turned the light to point more to the right, and finally, I stopped when the light started to land on a boat floating not too far away from us. I turned the light off at once. I told Tony to turn the cabin lights off as well. I put the boat in full throttle and steered away from the area. I steered the boat for about 5 to 10 minutes before thinking it was enough. We hung out outside for a while to ensure we weren't followed again. When it seemed safe to do so, we went to sleep. However, I woke to a thumping coming from above my head, above the cabin. I looked over at Tony sleeping on the couch. I whispered his name a few times to wake him up, and I pointed up at the ceiling. He looked up, then back at me with a look on his face telling me he heard the thumps. I opened the door to the deck and ran outside and saw 2 men, one on the bow of my boat, the other on a boat floating directly next to mine. Tony came running out behind me. Both of the men slowly put their hands up in front of their faces and claimed they meant no harm. The one on my boat said they were simply almost out of gas and needed help. He said he was going to knock on my cabin door to ask for assistance, but in my head, I was thinking, why was he on the bow of my boat? Done very low-key, I flicked Tony's thigh to indicate to him that I was getting ready to do something rash. The guy stepped down from the front of the boat to the lower deck, right in front of Tony and me. He was significantly taller and bigger than us. He looked at me for a few moments and reached out his hand, expecting a handshake. Without saying anything, I knew something was about to go down with these guys, and for all I knew, that could start with my shaking his hand. Instead of shaking his hand, I pushed the guy overboard into the water with all my strength and ran up the stairs to turn the boat on while I yelled at Tony to make sure they didn't get back on the boat. We were able to lose them in the night for good this time. I didn't stop, though I kept going the full 2 hours straight back to the shore. We made it back to my dock and slept on my boat that night. The next morning, we packed up and drove home. Strange things can happen out at sea in the dark, but I never anticipated anything like that. I don't know what those guys were planning on doing to us on my boat, but considering they had been making a point of stalking us, I know it was nothing good. Until I was about 25, I lived in a beach town. My specific neighborhood was about a 20-minute walk from the beach. I'd say about 80% of my personality was beach-related. I've been surfing longer than I've been able to speak, and it would be an anomaly for me to shake out a pair of shoes and not have some amount of sand fall out. My two best friends, let's call them Tom and David, were extroverted, outgoing, and charismatic. We were all 18 and very much obsessed with girls. It was a Saturday night in late May, just a few weeks before school let out. Senioritis had long since set in, and at this point, my friends and I regularly pushed the limits of how much we could get away with without getting in trouble. We already had our college acceptances, so we didn't really care much about high school anymore. Tom and I had plans to meet up with two girls from our high school that we've been getting along with really well. The plan was to pick the two of them up in the evening and enjoy a cool, breezy night on the beach. We had blankets and a few bottles of wine, the perfect combination for stargazing on the beach. I don't condone drinking and driving in any capacity, but I was just a stupid kid. I arrived at Lisa's house just after 9 o'clock. Her and Victoria sort of danced to the car. It was clear that they had a little something to drink beforehand. Tom night. I took a scenic route to a scenic beach. It was about a 30-minute drive. The whole time, the four of us were having a great time in the car, cracking jokes and talking about some mutual friends. At one point, Victoria and I were having a very deep philosophical conversation about the nature of time and death and such. We were all very much enjoying each other's company. The specific beach I had chosen had a dirt path that you could drive a car up. From there was a more narrow sand path that we would walk. The path was actually pretty steep, but I had picked it because we were less likely to encounter any other people at such a secluded spot. Furthermore, this beach was further away from the main boardwalk, so the sky would be clearer for stargazing. I thought of everything. I parked my car as far up the dirt road as possible, and the four of us hopped out. Tom and I carried the blankets and wine. I'll fast forward through the boring stuff. After a few hours and an empty bottle, Tom and I found ourselves separating. He and Victoria walked up the beach, and Lisa and I walked in the opposite direction. After being separated by a decent amount of distance and darkness, I threw my blanket down, and we drunkenly fell asleep on top of it. Before anything happened, Lisa tensed up. At first, I thought it was something that I had done, but then she whispered something. "Do you hear that?" I focused my attention and strained my ears, trying to hear something other than the gentle crashing of ocean waves. I assumed she was just drunk, but then to my surprise, I did hear something. It sounded almost like a whirring, like the sound a small engine would make. The sound seemed to be moving around. I couldn't pin down where it was even coming from, then it seemed to fade away into nothingness. "It's nothing," I assured her, eager to resume what we had been doing, and that's what we did. Soon after, I fished my shirt from the sand and shook it out before throwing it over my head. Just then, Lisa, who was still lying on the blanket, shrieked. I whipped around to look at her and saw she was pointing up at something. I looked up but couldn't see anything besides the blackness of the sky. I sat down next to her to get a better angle, and I was horrified. From her point of view, the moon was perfectly aligned with what appeared to be a drone floating directly overhead. It hovered a little while longer before zipping up into the dark sky and disappearing out of sight. It all made sense. That noise that we had heard before was 100% the drone. I got angry at myself for not realizing at the time. I then got sick at the thought of being watched that entire time. I glanced over at Lisa and could tell she had the same exact feeling. She put her head in her hands and started crying. I consoled her as best I could before suggesting we walk back to the car. The two of us made it to the car to find Tom and Victoria already there. I quickly explained the situation. The two of them were dumbfounded, and I could feel the joy in the air literally being sucked out. I began driving in silence in the direction of Lisa's house, eventually trying to lighten the mood with some conversation. It didn't work, though. The girls agreed that they didn't feel safe going home just yet. It was a Saturday night, so I didn't mind staying out late. I asked if we could hang out at either of their houses. They both shook their heads, saying their parents wouldn't allow it. My house was off the table for the same reason, as was Tom's. I decided to ask Tom to call up David, which he did. David's house was massive, and his parents were super chill. It was honestly the perfect spot. To our delight, David was free. I pulled into David's driveway and parked the car. Tom and the two girls began making their way towards David's front door, and I told them I'd catch up to them in a second. I needed a second to think about everything that had just happened. I was more shaken up than I was letting on, so I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes in an attempt to calm down a bit. Honestly, those few seconds with my eyes closed really helped. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone, which I hadn't even touched since the incident. The screen lit up, and I stared at the single notification that sat on the display. I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My entire body froze as I stared in horror at the lone notification, "AirTag found moving with you." Every emotion that I had just expelled from my body came crashing back. We were literally being tracked. I snapped out of my paralysis and jumped out of the car, examining every inch of the vehicle. Nothing on the front bumper, nothing in the grille, and nothing on the back. I started getting desperate, checking the seats and flipping floor mats. Still nothing. By now, sweat was pouring down my neck, and I could feel the hairs on my arms and legs clamping up. I got on my hands and knees and began examining the underside of my car. I got to the tire on the driver's side and began feeling around the tire well, and there it was. It was literally taped to the underside of the well, impossible to find if you didn't know what you were looking for. I held the tag in my hand for a few seconds before throwing it to the ground and smashing it to pieces. Whoever had watched us on the beach with that drone knew where we were. I didn't feel safe in David's driveway all alone. I picked up one of the broken AirTag pieces and ran over to David's front door. I told everyone what I had discovered, showing them the AirTag pieces to prove it. They were even more horrified than I was, especially the girls. They checked their phones and saw the same notification. David was particularly pissed off because we had been potentially tracked back to his house. After the panic subsided, we spent the rest of the night in David's basement and ended up sleeping over. A couple of weeks passed, and nothing happened. Honestly, my friends and I were glad to forget about the whole thing, assuming it was entirely in the past. The only way we could rationalize it was that some creep wanted to watch some young adults hook up on the beach and track their car to scare them. It was chilling to think about, but we were relieved that the situation hadn't escalated. One Sunday morning, about 3 weeks after the incident, I got a call from David. He screamed through the phone for me to drive to his house as soon as possible, which I did. When I got there, he was standing in his driveway with a concerned look on his face and some papers in his hand. I was confused until I realized what he was holding. They weren't papers, but rather pictures. I examined them more closely. They were pictures of me from that night on the beach. They were grainy and dimly lit, but you could clearly see Lisa and me in revealing fashion. I was disgusted. I could only imagine how Lisa would feel upon finding out. Not knowing what to do, we called the police and explained the situation. They told us that there was essentially nothing they could do, but we insisted that they at least scan the photos for prints. They eventually got back to us, saying the photos turned up nothing. Lisa was terrified that whoever sent them would try and blackmail her, and I feared the same. The experience was downright traumatizing. Luckily, nothing ever happened after that, probably because we had gotten the police involved. Lisa was never quite the same around me after what happened, and I can't blame her. I can only hope those pictures don't turn up later in my life. Back in the late summer of 2007, I was working on a tugboat that was assisting an oil tanker off the coast of Louisiana. There had been some storms and rough seas, so as much as we weren't in any danger, our tug had been helping to stabilize the tanker, which was way more vulnerable to the large waves. I always loved the water, and I still do, but on the morning of August 10th, as we were guiding that tanker along the coast, something put that love to the test in a big, very bad way. I was in the bathroom when it happened, probably the worst place you can be when you get hit by a freak wave. I had been awake for maybe no more than 5 to 10 minutes, and then out of nowhere, everything got turned upside down. 1 second the toilet was on the floor, and the next, it was on the ceiling. I tried to open the door to the bathroom, but all the lights suddenly went out, and I could hear the bathroom slowly filling with water. I couldn't tell if it was blood or seawater stinging my eyes. Then I finally got the bathroom door open, but I didn't have long to celebrate because I felt this heavy thunk as the tugboat touched down on the seabed at least 100 feet below the surface. When we got the door open, everything was dark. Water was everywhere, and I had no idea which way I was facing. Our propeller was up, our wheelhouse was down, and in the alley next to the watertight door, which led to an exit hatch, I saw 2 of my coworkers struggling with the hatch as the water levels continued to rise. I panicked, thinking we'd all drown if we failed to get that door open, so I did something completely against my instincts and dived into the water to look for a different way to escape. I don't imagine many of y'all have been in a shipwreck before, but when your ship goes down like ours did and takes on a ton of water, it rushes through your ship in very odd patterns. Imagine pouring a gallon of water into an ant farm and watch how it reaches some tunnels faster than others and creates little air pockets here and there. Well, that's how I managed to get swept into a second bathroom, this one attached to the second engineer's cabin. With the door having been swept shut as I pulled into it, it created one of those air pockets I had just mentioned. At first, the water continued to rise, and I thought that I was going to be trapped in there and drown, but to my relief, it didn't fill the bathroom completely. It only filled up about a third of the way and then just suddenly stopped. Part of the reason it didn't fill up was because we routinely kept all the cabin doors closed. We did this mainly as a security precaution, but it also secured parts of the ship from flooding and meant that I could cling to a wash basin in my own private air bubble at the bottom of the Gulf. As I stood there in the darkness, I started to hear my coworkers screaming and yelling. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I figured that they might have gotten the hatch open, so with that in mind, I decided to do everything I could to swim back to them. But when I tried to pry the bathroom door open, the door handle snapped off in my grip. I remember feeling a panic rising up in me again, one so intense I thought that I might lose my mind right there and then. But then suddenly, it just stopped, and I felt this strange sense of calm wash over me. Everything that had happened over the previous few minutes had been so chaotic and terrifying, but after that door handle snapped off in my hand, it felt like I had control of the situation. I knew where I was, I knew what I needed to do, and I had no choice but to solve the problem of opening the door. It was that or die trying, and as crazy as it sounds, just thinking that to myself all these years later brought about that strange sense of calm. It was just me and that bathroom door. Whatever came next, we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I remember spotting a vent and thinking that if I pulled off the steel grill, I could probably use it as some kind of tool. Luckily, it was strong enough for me to use to force open the bathroom door, but that wasn't an instant thing. It took a lot of time and effort, and during the attempt, I heard the cries of my coworkers going silent one by one. I thought they had escaped, but now I know differently. Once I had the bathroom door open, I was back in the second engineer's cabin. I saw 2 life jackets, each with a small flashlight attached. I put one in my mouth, lodged the other in the elastic of my underwear, and then attempted to swim for the escape hatch. Outside of the cabin, all the corridors were full of water with no air pockets for me to use, meaning every time I ran out of breath, I had to stop trying to open the hatch and swim back to my air pocket in the engineer's cabin to take a breath. The first time I swam back, I almost missed the door to the engineer's cabin. It was dark, all the doors looked the same, and I knew that if I got lost or confused, I'd most likely drown. I later found out the exact confused, I'd most likely drown. I later found out the exact same thing happened to a coworker who drowned in the mess room after confusing it for someplace with an air pocket. To stop myself from getting turned around, I tore off some fabric from one of the engineer's coveralls, tied it into a rope, and then attached one end to the door of the cabin so I could use it to guide myself back whenever I ran out of breath. I tried again and again, but still, the hatch wouldn't budge, and I eventually decided that I should save my strength, stay in my little air pocket, and rethink my attempts to escape. I had to just stay put, stay calm, and think. And I'm not kidding when I say hours went by. I ate tin sardines and drank canned soda just to keep my energy levels up, but I had to keep my legs out of the water. I knew I'd scraped my leg during one of my escape attempts, and at first, I thought the stinging was just the salt water getting into the wounds, but I quickly realized it wasn't just the salt water. It was little crayfish swimming up to pick at the peeling skin around the wound. I also thought the water level would remain stable, but after a while, I realized it was slowly rising from how it seemed to be creeping up the wall. And that's about the time I just accepted that I was going to die. I kept thinking about my family, and it brought me a strange sense of peace knowing that they'd be there to carry on without me. Sure, it would hurt some my kids would grow up without their father, but they'd no doubt get a big payout from the company, and then on top of my life insurance, they might just get a big enough check to keep them comfy for the rest of their lives. Imagining and thinking those kinds of thoughts was all I could do to comfort myself, and I remember just sitting there, trying to conserve whatever oxygen I had left, in total silence, just waiting around to die. Then suddenly, the silence was broken by the sudden sound of metal on metal. It was like a hard clunk, and although I couldn't see what was going on outside the boat, I knew that there was a good chance someone was out there, someone that might be able to hear me. I didn't scream or yell, as that would have burned valuable oxygen. Instead, I started to hammer my fist against the bulkhead, hoping whoever was out there would recognize that someone was alive inside the tub. Minutes later, I saw a light through one of the portholes and realized that there must have been divers swimming around outside. I took a deep breath and then dived back into the water. My goal was to find a porthole through which I could see the divers, so I went room to room, prying open doors, then heading back to the air pocket for another gulp of oxygen. Then back I went, repeating the process over and over until finally, I caught sight of the divers outside. I remember pushing my hand up against the safety glass, and one of the divers later said he just thought it was another body at first. But when I started trying to bang on the glass, they realized I was alive. I wasn't taken straight to the surface. You'd think that that might have caused more emotional turmoil than it did, and after being trapped in a wreck like that, most would want to return straight to the surface. But you can't do that. The sudden change in pressure might actually kill you. So I spent a real long time in a diving bell, sucking air from a spare oxygen tank, before I was allowed to resurface. The divers told me I'd been down there for almost 14 hours. I don't even think it felt like 3. I guess my sense of time was disoriented, but resurfacing to the night sky instead of daylight made it feel like I time traveled or something. A bunch of medics checked my vitals to ensure my temperature and blood pressure were okay, and then they advised that I go visit a hospital. But all I wanted to do was get home to my wife and kids. So, although I wouldn't advise anyone to ignore medical advice like that, I went straight home and gave them all the biggest hugs of their lives. I had some real bad dreams for a long time afterward. Sometimes, I'd feel like my bed was sinking, and I'd wake up with sweat-soaked bed sheets, which I guess prolonged the process of realizing it was just a nightmare. Other times, I'd dream that water was rushing in via my bedroom windows and that my wife was unconscious. I'd pick her up, carry her to the door, but it wouldn't open, and the water would just keep rising and rising until I woke up. Some friends suggested that we just take a vacation someplace really landlocked, and that helped a whole lot. I stayed away from the pool for a whole week and a half, though, until I finally forced myself to face my fears. I guess the context of that vacation helped, knowing that I was safe. And like I said at the start, I've always loved the water. Me, Leonard, and our third friend Jack were going to spend a few unsupervised days at Leonard Beach House in LBI. Jack was a year older than Leonard and me and had recently gotten his license, so we'd be driving down in his car. The drive down was fantastic. Jack was a pretty uncoordinated driver at the time, so most of the ride was spent laughing at him swerving and cursing the road. It was great. We got down to LBI in good time and immediately moved all of our stuff from the car to the rooms we'd be staying in. The layout of the house is important to the story, so I'll briefly mention it. There's a front door, a garage door which connects the back to the front yard, a back sliding door, and a back upstairs deck that connects the upstairs bedrooms. There's also a spiral staircase that allows you to go directly from the back deck to the ground so you can enter and exit the house from upstairs. The house sits along a lagoon, meaning the back end of the house faces a narrow channel of water with houses on the opposite side. We were at that ripe age where chasing girls was a priority, and a nice beach house all to ourselves was the perfect occasion. We spent a few hours figuring out which girls were down the shore at the time and talked to them on Snapchat. Finally, we found a group of 3 cute girls that said they'd be down to come kick back at Leonard House. I had more than enough weed to last us the weekend, and we had snagged a few bottles of our parents' alcohol before leaving. It was perfect. Things were going very well. The three girls, Rosie, Alexa, and Sophie, were fun and flirty, and the three of us could tell where the night would probably end up. At one point, the six of us decided to smoke in Leonard's backyard pool. It was small but perfect for 6 drunk kids. I remember the sight vividly, the gentle bay breeze blowing through my hair, the steam from the heated water rising slowly with the puffs of smoke from the joints. At our age, this was bliss. But then suddenly, Leonard turned the music all the way down and stared over my shoulder into the darkness of the lagoon. Confused, I turned around, peering into the darkness. I could roughly make out the houses on the other side of the lagoon, but I wasn't quite sure what Leonard was looking at. One of the girls asked Leonard why he turned the music down, and he whispered that he saw someone standing on the dock opposite the house. I figured he was messing with us, so I started laughing. "Who cares, bro? People literally live here," I said. Leonard shook his head. "I know that family personally. My parents said they're in Florida for the week." In all honesty, I still thought it wasn't a big deal or he was just messing around, so I kept chuckling. The girls were a little freaked out, though, and said they wanted to go back inside. I wasn't going to argue, so the 6 of us started making our way out of the pool. As we were drying off in the yard, Jack jumped and cursed, looking towards the lagoon. The rest of us turned, and even though the light was dim, I could definitely see what looked like movement coming from the opposite dock. The 6 of us froze in place, trying to get a better glimpse of what we were looking at. Just then, a passing car on the road across from us lit up the scene ever so slightly, and the sight was horrifying. There were 4 tall silhouettes standing at the edge of the dock, facing us. It was impossible to tell what they were wearing or what they looked like, but there was no doubt they were facing our direction. "Go inside now," said Leonard with a shaky voice, motioning us toward the sliding door. As we rushed inside, I heard a distinct sound that remains the most terrifying noise I'd ever heard, for consecutive splashes rang out from behind us. Those guys were swimming across the lagoon. We were in full-on panic mode at that point. The girls screamed while Jack slammed the sliding door shut and locked it. Leonard quickly ran to the front to lock that door too, and the 6 of us ran to a room that wasn't visible from the outside. We waited in silence, horrified at what we might hear next. A few minutes passed, still nothing. Out of nowhere, Jack cursed, revealing to us that he had forgotten to lock the sliding door on the deck. Leonard started to panic, knowing that this house was about to be broken into. Just then, we heard soft, quieted footsteps above us, and that was the last straw. None of us had any weapons on hand, and we were all intoxicated, so running was really our only option. The 6 of us sprinted for the front door and bolted to the car, which Jack started up in a flash. The chaos of it all was too much for Jack to handle, and he destroyed Leonard's mailbox on the way out of the driveway. Once we were far enough away, we called the police. The ordeal was a nightmare. We went back to the house once the police had searched it, but the news was shattering. All the valuables on the top floor were missing, but that wasn't the worst part. Leonard's family owned a medium-sized Boston whaler boat, which was also stolen, most likely as the getaway vehicle. Leonard's father tended to keep a spare set of keys inside a small hatch below the steering wheel, which the police concluded was how the culprits got away so quickly. How they knew where the key was hidden is something I still wonder. The police were never able to arrest the perpetrators and likely never will. Leonard, Jack, and I think whoever robbed the house might have been someone who knew Leonard's family. They knew where the key was and that the house was supposed to be vacant that weekend as well. It's been a long time since this chilling event took place, but I haven't let one day pass without locking every door and window in my home. Do yourself a favor and lock your doors at night. Back in late August of 1989, my friend and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 40-ton yacht named Tamaro from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid handsomely to do so. We had years of sailing experience between us, but the 5,000-mile journey was the furthest either of us had ever been on. We were confident that we could do it, but early on, there was a worrying change in the weather's forecast. Statistically, hurricanes happened really late in the South Pacific and tend to arrive in mid to late October, so by setting sail in late August, we figured that we'd avoid the worst of the bad weather. But as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we were faced with a Category 4 hurricane, which whipped up waves as high as 20-story buildings. We'd sailed through gales and storms before, but never a hurricane. We tried to escape it for 3 days, but the boat could only go 15 miles per hour, and so eventually, it caught up with us. It was too late for us to turn around and escape, so we had no choice but to brave it head-on. We put on our raincoats and boarded up the yacht, all while 140 miles per hour winds and 40-foot waves battered against the boat. The wind and rain felt like BB pellets on our skin, and it was like nothing we'd ever felt before. But we were still confident of being able to handle the situation. We just had to wait for the worst to be over. At one point, I remember heading below deck to get something, and then I suddenly heard my fiancé yell out, "Oh my God." We got caught in a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember is my head smashing into something before everything just went fuzzy. I think I must have been out for a minute or two because when I woke up, there was blood all over my face and raincoat, and I was lying on the floor. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I went topside to check on him. The last I'd seen of him, he was strapping himself into the safety harness, but when I went to check on him, the harness was empty, and he was nowhere to be seen. I remember screaming, but I knew I had to pull myself together. There'd be time to grieve later, and if I didn't focus on the task ahead of me, people would end up grieving me too. I knew the yacht had suffered irreparable damage that would make it impossible to sail. The navigation system, engine, and even the sails were all waterlogged or shredded beyond repair. But even worse, the yacht itself was taking on water at crazy speeds. My instincts kicked in, and I started pumping water out of the cabin before using the storm jib and a broken pole to create an improvised sail. The only tools I had at hand were a sextant and a watch, but I had enough sailing experience to use them to navigate to land. After 41 days of drifting in the Pacific, rationing my canned food and water, I finally spotted land. It turned out to be the Hawaiian island of Hilo, and as I slowly drifted towards the harbor, I was spotted by a Japanese ship and rescued. For weeks afterward, I kept one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that got me through. I put all the pain and grief to the back of my mind, and once I was safe, it all came gushing out of me like water through a broken dam. It took me many years to get back to sailing, and these days I'm much more cautious about the jobs I accept. I thought about retiring from it altogether, but after a while, I realized that it's where I belong. If there's one silver lining to the dark cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.